All right. We left off with module six. So before we get kind of started here, I got quite a bit of stuff we want to go through today, and I think it'll probably spill over into tomorrow as well. But before we get going, um, we've got kind of that Canvas discussion that I had kind of mentioned that I would kind of talk a little more about. So I posted it yesterday. So if we go here and kind of take a look at it. So what I did um, was make sure okay. So what we were doing was trying to tie together changes in pull um, and things that might change the aggregate demand curve. So this is what we were kind of talking about in module five and have extended this into module six. Um, this first kind of prompt that I give you is we're thinking about what happens to prices and inflation, and then what is that relationship to both labor supply and then education levels. Okay. So here I kind of give you this prompt. I want you to get AI to produce a graph for you. Excuse me. Um, and so you'll, kind of feed it that prompt. Um, and then what I've got, here, right? Once you feed this to it, it may, depending on the generative AI tool that you're using, it may be able to produce it right away. If it doesn't, right, what I want you to do is kind of give it some additional follow-up prompts until you're able to obtain a graph where essentially you have the CPI as well as the labor supply in the United States on the same graph. Okay. So if you then kind of check out these links, right, this is the actual data. So hopefully this is where it's pulling from, right? Uh, however, right, if it doesn't match up, that's going to be something that you kind of mentioned. Okay. Um, and then in kind of problem two, the next thing I ask you to do is basically have it try to create a prompt as well, or a graph as well, using this kind of prompt. Now, when we're talking about human capital education levels, it's probably going to ask you follow-up questions about what variable you want to use. So you'll kind of, in the subsequent prompts, tell it which measure of education that you would like to use, putting it on the same graph as prices, CPI, right? So we can kind of think about its relationship to inflation. And then basically kind of answer in both 1A and 2B. Why might the graph that you see, why might the trends look a little bit different, right? So why might not, or why might the correlation between prices and labor supply and prices and education levels, why might those not be like exactly one to one? And then in part A for two, basically, because you'll have to choose some measure of education, one of your responses to another student, so same kind of idea as the last one, you'll have one initial post responding, two responses to other students. One of those should be to find someone's answer or post to, the part of their post to problem two and compare and contrast the different measure that they use. So you'll kind of have to search through, find someone that used a slightly different measure of education than you did, kind of compare and contrast why the benefits of the variable you selected versus theirs, so pros and cons. That'll be one of your responses to another student. Then problem three, we're thinking about, okay, now not how one of these factors of pull relates to prices or inflation, but how does something that would shift the aggregate demand? So this specific in this prompt I'm giving you, the specific thing we're thinking about is how price levels are correlated with real interest rates. So this is one of the shifters of aggregate demand was whether interest rates are higher or lower. So basically, we're wanting to kind of put these on a graph as well. Now, I know ahead of time through some not practice, but kind of going through this exercise that this one it's likely going to be the hardest for your AI tool to do Now, if it's able to right away, what did it choose to measure real interest rates? So there's going to be different measures, right? And did you have to give it any follow-up prompts, right? Um, Whatever it's able to arrive at in terms of using real interest rates, the second prompt I want you to tell it after you kind of get this graph is instead of using these real interest rates, use mortgage rates. So this is just kind of a proxy for what real interest rates are, and kind of see whether or not it's able to produce a graph. Okay. So in that response to your second prompt, was your AI tool able to produce this graph? How many additional prompts did you have to give it? And were you able to eventually create it? And if you go down the line and you have five or six, back and forths with your AI tool, then you can mention that you weren't able to get the graph after five or six prompts. And then kind of one of the responses you'll have to other students is basically whatever measure of real interest rates that the AI tool kind of created for you, find someone else who it suggested or who it had used a different measure of real interest rates. So some of the examples of this could be personal loan rates versus the federal funds rates. There's, a list of things that could be used to measure the real interest rate, kind of compare and contrast the variable that it selected for you, compared to someone who had a different one. Okay. So that's the kind of Canvas discussion. If you have any questions as you're working through it, feel free to reach out. But once again, kind of the longer post would be like responses to each one of these 3B, 2B, and then problem one. And then your responses to other students are 2A and 3A. So it's kind of mentioned in the instructions here. Okay. Any questions on that before we kind of keep moving here? Okay. So the other thing that I want to look at here today. So what did we have? It's the 8th. I want to make sure I call this the right thing before we dive into it. So we left off looking at um, single changes in either aggregate demand or in aggregate supply, kind of long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply chain shifts. So what we'll do instead today, there we go, is we're going to think about what if we have these changes simultaneously. Yeah, so I'll post the practice questions up after class today. We probably won't completely be done with module six, but at least in terms of what we covered, the practice problems I post will kind of cover those. Okay. And I am, we'll see where we get to. I probably will hold off, just based off of I know kind of how this class, today's going to go. I probably won't post that sixth quiz until tomorrow, and then you'll kind of have 2 days from there because that crosses over the weekend. That really won't be due until Monday, so I have quite a bit of time to kind of work through those practice problems and complete quiz three. So, what if we had something like the following? So, let me think what I want here. Let's do. We see that education levels are increasing in an economy. And then at the same time, let's assume that exchange rates improve. Okay. So when we're thinking about these changes, I think that maybe the easiest way is to kind of put them on separate graphs. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to show you what happens if we put them on the same graph. Okay. So if I've got kind of price levels here, I've got my real GDP. We said we've got this downward sloping aggregate demand curve. We've still got our vertical long run aggregate supply curve. But we said because prices are sticky, in the short run, our aggregate supply can be responsive to price changes, so it won't be completely vertical. And kind of our initial equilibrium is going to be where long run aggregate supply, and actually, I'll kind of do GDP here, is equal to short run aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand. So what happens from each of these changes? Well, if education levels go up, right, this is one of our factors of pull, right? It's education. So what that's going to do is it's going to increase both our long run aggregate supply and our short run. So we're going to have an increase, which means a shift to the right. So I could think about it here. So we've got, here's my second kind of, or my new long run and my new short run aggregate and long run aggregate and short run aggregate supply curves. Okay. Now, what does that do? We know that that's going to push kind of our equilibrium price down, but it's going to push our GDP up. Now, this is a change in both our long and short run supply curves. So this is going to be the impacts that occur both in the short run and in the long run. Okay. So short run and long run prices will go down. Long run, short run GDP is going to go up. Sorry, this is a 2 if you can't quite see that. Okay. So what were the kind of impacts here? We saw prices go down. We saw real GDP go up. Okay. Now, if at the same time, oh, I missed something in the chat here. Oh no, that was what we had earlier. Okay, just making sure. So if at the same time, I'll slide this up a little bit and leave us some space. So let's say I kind of have that same setup, but now I want to identify. All right, so I have my aggregate demand curve. I've got this long run aggregate supply curve. Well, should have saved myself more room here, but it'll be okay. I think I can make this work. So here was my kind of initial price, my initial GDP. If I had exchange rates improve, right, what's that going to do? Well, if exchange rates improve, right, that's going to increase expenditures or increase our aggregate demand. So in the short run, what's going to happen? Well, in the short run, our GDP is going to be higher. Where does that short run aggregate supply hit our aggregate demand curve? And in the short run, prices are also going to be higher. Right? So the combination of these two things, so we see that prices go up as a result of that aggregate demand increase, and real GDP also, oops, I forgot my G there, also increases. So if we think about here in the short run, what is the total effect here? Right? So in the short run, we know that GDP is going to go up because both of these changes are increasing real GDP. Now, however, in the short run, right, and it ends up being the true in the long run as well, and we'll kind of identify this here in a second. But in the short run, what's going to happen to price? We don't know, right? It depends on which of these changes is larger. So if that aggregate demand increase, so let's say if I have this aggregate demand increase, if that's larger than the long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply increase that we saw, then we know that, well, if this shift is larger, its effects on price will be the one that kind of overshadows the other or is greater. So there we would know that prices have to increase. Or if we went in reverse, if I told you prices increase, you know that that shift in aggregate demand, that's the one that was kind of dictating the total effect. That must have been the larger change. Okay. Any questions on that idea before I kind of do something slightly different? Okay. So what's going to happen in the long run from that aggregate demand change? Well, here we know that these changes will exist in the short and the long run because it's shifting our long and short run aggregate supply curves. But when aggregate demand increases, yes, in the short run, it increases GDP. and increases our price level. But where is the long run equilibrium? It's now at that point where my long run average supply curve hits my new aggregate demand curve. So prices in the long run, so I put P3 here, but you can think about like my new prices in the long run. So we can read this here. They're going to be even higher than the short run prices. Okay. So we know that initially, if the short run GDP is too high and that prices are going to go up even more, we had an inflationary gap. Okay. So we have this inflationary gap, right? There's kind of mentioning old things here. We're not necessarily going to use that right now. But another thing I wanted to point out here is so we know that prices in the long run will increase even more from this combination than our prices increased in the short run. Okay. But what do we also know? In the long run, what happens? We return to the same real level of GDP. So in the long run, our real GDP is unchanged or stays the same. Okay? So in the short run, real GDP is going to increase, right? But in the long run, if we had this situation, if it was just this change, we know we'll return to those long run kind of outcomes. Now, in this example, we had simultaneous changes, so it's not the same long run aggregate supply curve. It's actually going to increase. But I just wanted to kind of go back and reiterate that point. If we only had this change in aggregate demand, the aggregate demand shift itself doesn't actually change real GDP. So if these things happen at the same time and you're asked about what happens to long run real GDP, well, the aggregate demand impact has no change. The long run aggregate supply shift is the one that completely drives the change in the long run. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So let me think about the order in which I want to do this. I think there's one more thing I want to go through. So long run total is GDP increase and prices would be indeterminate. Yeah, unless we know which of those changes is larger, we don't know what's going to happen to long run equilibrium prices. But we know that in the long run, the only thing that kind of dictates what happens to long run real GDP is the shift in aggregate long run aggregate supply. And so that in that case, it was increasing our real GDP. Okay. All right. So let me think here what I want to do. Um, so we'll work through one other thing here before I kind of switch gears. So when we have these prices be indeterminate, I just want to kind of make another point here. So let's say instead, and I think just working through more examples is always helpful. So let's say instead we had an example like this. So I've got my aggregate demand curve. I've got my initial long run aggregate supply curve. We start out in equilibrium. That's going to hit my aggregate demand at the same point as my short run. So here we've got our initial equilibrium price, our initial equilibrium GDP, and I want to think here about two changes. So let's say that labor supply decreases. Okay. So if the labor supply decreases, and we'll assume that at the same time, what do I want here to make sure that we get an interesting example? So if I want that to go down, yeah. So let's do this. Okay. So if at the same time I see that net, actually, we could even do a different one here just to kind of make this point. I think it'll help. let's say net imports actually decrease. So this is imports. Well, when we're calculating real GDP, remember, this was C plus I plus G plus net exports, which were exports minus imports. So if imports go, I shouldn't have said net here. Really, I'm just thinking about imports. If imports decrease, what's happening to this calculate? Well, I'm subtracting a smaller number. Real GDP is actually going up. Or think about it this way, the overall consumption in our economy is actually increasing, right? We're not buying as many things from abroad, we're importing less, so we are increasing expenditures kind of domestically. So what would this increase, or sorry, decrease in imports cause? An increase in aggregate demand. Okay. So I probably should have done these in different colors here. So just to kind of help, we'll use blue to kind of represent this decrease in imports. So what did that do? That increased aggregate demand. What did a decrease in the labor supply do? Well, that was one of the factors of pull. So it's going to shift both our short run and long run aggregate supply curves, and it's going to decrease them. Okay. So decreases in labor supply are going to look something like this. So here's, try to draw this parallel. Well, I'm a little bit off, but so here's our short run aggregate supply, our new long run aggregate supply. Okay. If these are exactly the same shifts, right? So here, what impact did I have, first of all? Well, this new kind of equilibrium point, right? After just that labor supply decrease, that should do what? That's pushing prices up, but it's pushing my GDP down. Okay. Now, if at the same time I had, so what do I want to make sure we have here? Um, mm, Oh, I actually want to show you a different example. Sorry. I want to make this point because I think it'll be more interesting. This one wouldn't be very interesting because aggregate demand is going to go up. Both of them push prices up. I wanted to make an additional point. So let's say instead, let's do an example where imports go up. So if imports instead go up, I'm subtracting a larger amount. Real GDP is going to go down. So we're going to have an aggregate demand decrease. So this is, it'll be a more interesting example. So sorry, I want to do this just to kind of make the point because this one's a little bit more difficult. So I want to work through the more difficult kind of combinations of or simultaneous changes. So if I see a decrease in aggregate demand, right, how would I end up with the exact same price level as I had before? Mhm. Well, in the long run, if my aggregate demand curve decreases, if it pushed it back to this point where long run aggregate supply is the same as my aggregate demand, I would see that, okay, what has happened? I still see a decrease in GDP, and that's because the only thing that changes real GDP in the long run is that shift in my long run aggregate supply. So this decrease in aggregate demand, it may, right, lower prices, right? It's decreasing the prices compared to kind of where it would be in the long run, but it's also not causing any change in my real GDP because no matter where this ends up at, we're still going to end up in that same lower level of GDP that is dictated by the long run average supply curve shifting to the left. So you can kind of think about the change in the long run that's caused by this aggregate demand shift. It's not going to cause GDP to change at all. So we know GDP is going to go down in the long run. We don't know what's going to happen to prices, but notice here when we were thinking about that total effect, right? We don't know what's going to happen to prices. What could happen if these shifts equally offset each other? We actually end up back at the same exact price level. Okay. That is a possibility. Mhm. So a lot of these it's going to be indeterminate and it could increase or decrease if I tell you what the relative size is. If the shifts are exactly the same, we know that prices would actually stay the same and we would see long run GDP decrease. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay, so before we talk about simultaneous changes and their impact on inflationary and deflationary gaps, I want to kind of go through, excuse me, I want to make sure we have something set up for once we cover this. Okay. So the next thing that we want to go through is if there is an inflationary or deflationary gap, what is the response going to be? So we're going to take a step away from simultaneous changes for a second, and we're going to think about what is the response if we do have a shift. So last class we talked about how can we get these inflationary or these deflationary or recessionary gaps? They can be caused by changes in aggregate demand, or they can be caused in the short run by kind of shifts in that short run aggregate supply curve, right? So the one that we'll kind of focus on here is let's say I have a shift in aggregate demand, right? Change in aggregate demand. So what's going to happen? Right? Well, initially, when my aggregate demand started out 81, right? Initially, when I have this aggregate demand shift, the short run equilibrium will be where my aggregate demand now hits that short run aggregate supply. That's going to be at a short run price that is higher than it was before, but we know that over time, we're going to end up back at that long run aggregate supply level. So we know that prices will initially increase, but in the future, they're going to increase even more, right? So if we have even higher prices, that means that the real value of our wages are going down. Lower levels of real GDP, we said cause unemployment or decrease employment. And then we know that in the short run, in order to adjust to this, we're actually going to see short run aggregate supply decrease. Okay. So in this example, the new short run GDP is greater than where we know we'll be at in the long run. So we know that the current level of GDP is too high, in which case we said that would be an indicator that we have this inflationary gap. Um, one way to think about this as, why we would call this the fact that GDP is higher in the short run, it must mean that economic times are good. We talked about the fact that there's these cyclical natures to the economy, there's ebbs and flows. And so if we ever end up with a current GDP that's higher than the long run average, we must be going through a positive economic conditions, right? And so if that's the case, we know that prices in the long run will rise even more, or we have kind of this expected inflation, which is why we call this gap between real GDP an inflationary gap. Now, over time, right, because this is kind of, we expect the prices to increase, right? That's going to decrease real wages, decrease employment. So those short run aggregate supply, if we see like a decrease in employment, that's going to mean we don't have as many people working. We're going to kind of see this, right? Cyclical unemployment kind of push us back to where we have a lower short run aggregate supply. So remember, these shifts in aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, they are somewhat counterintuitive because decreases are actually shifts to the left. So it looks like it shifted to be higher, but it's decreasing because at the same price level, we're supplying less than before. That's why this shift to the left is a decrease. So in response to this inflationary gap, and expected future inflation, we see that companies kind of adjust, right? Consumers adjust because they know the real value of their wages is going to go down in the future. And so we kind of have this shift in the short run aggregate supply. until we get to this point where long run prices are at their long run equilibrium. So inflationary gaps are temporary. In the long run, we'll kind of end up at this level of GDP dictated by our long run aggregate supply curve. And the way in which that occurs is through kind of shifts in that short run aggregate supply curve, where um, we know that if there's expectations of inflation, there's going to be increases in unemployment and therefore kind of lower levels of output are going to be able to produce by firms or companies in the short run. Okay. Let me see in the chat here. So why did the average demand curve cause so why did the aggregate demand increase cause the so it's not that it caused the short and aggregate supply to necessarily so it's not increasing here, right? It's actually decreasing our short run aggregate supply, right? And that's because shifts to the left or shifts upward, that's actually a decrease. Okay. Now the fact that it caused the shift, it's not that the aggregate demand increase automatically caused that change, but it's the fact that it increased prices, right? And we know that the response to increased prices will be that we see, firms choose, we know that there's going to be even higher prices in the future. They're going to act today as though those prices are higher. And so, in response to the fact that we have expected inflation, we're going to see that overall employment kind of decreases, meaning that companies have, right, what was one of the things that impacted long-run average supply? Labor supply. So, if labor supply or unemployment is going up, labor supply is going down. You can kind of think about it. But it's, long-run aggregate supply was our natural rate of unemployment. This kind of current higher level, it's capturing the fact that cyclical unemployment is relatively low, kind of artificially low, because we have these ebbs and flows to the economy. We know that eventually that unemployment level is going to return to the natural rate, which will kind of push us to this longer aggregate supply level. So if we expect inflation moving forward, that's going to result in decreases in employment, kind of pushing us back to that long run aggregate supply, back to that point where we would have this natural rate of unemployment. Does that answer the question there? I know it's a difficult kind of concept there, but the fact that these prices are being pushed higher from the aggregate demand shift, well, then in response, we would see that short run aggregate supply decreases, right, or shifts to the left until we get to that long run equilibrium point. Because we don't have any new resources, so long run aggregate supply won't shift, right? The only thing that's going to change is the response to those higher prices by firms. Questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. Um, sorry, that was loud. Uh, so the next thing we can kind of think about, what if instead we have a recessionary gap, right? So I'm going to draw this out. Once again, I'm probably taking a little bit more time even than I need to, but I think it's worthwhile to kind of go through module 6 slow, because it does get tricky. So let's instead assume that we have a recessionary gap. Okay. So let's see, we've got here's our initial aggregate demand. Here's our initial long run aggregate supply. Here's our short run aggregate supply. What do I want to think about here? Just want to make sure we have an interesting example. So here was kind of our current price level. Here was our kind of initial or kind of current GDP. We then have something that decreases our aggregate demand. So maybe this is we have higher real interest rates, right? Well, if interest rates are higher, it's more expensive to borrow money, right? That, or think about it this way, so you know, um, people are going to borrow less, or if they do borrow, they're going to have less money to consume products. So we're going to see kind of consumption decrease. Remember, aggregate demand. I said the one way to think about all these factors that influence, usually through the consumer lens, is the easiest way to think about it. So higher interest rates means it's going to be more expensive to borrow. We see a decrease in consumption, which lowers our aggregate demand curve. So if that happens, okay, so here's our aggregate demand. It's now lower or decreased to the left. Where is our short run price and where is our kind of short run GDP? So I could think about here's my new short run price. Here's my new short run GDP. Okay. So the fact that my GDP in the short run is now less than, well, where will the long run equilibrium be? Still at this same level of GDP, right? Long run aggregate supply hasn't shifted. So the fact that our short run GDP is less than our long run GDP, we would kind of call this, right? We have output that's too low. Economic conditions are bad. We have a recessionary gap. Now, the fact that we've seen prices decrease, right? We know that actually where is the new long run price? Well, it's where our new aggregate demand hits our long run aggregate supply curve. So maybe doing this here. Here's our new long run price, right? And once again, this is our long run GDP. In the short run, aggregate demand, sorry, in the long run, aggregate demand shifts don't change that equilibrium level of real GDP. None of our factors of pull have changed. The only thing that it does is it causes kind of prices to go down even more, right? So instead of a recessionary gap, we said if those current short run prices are greater than what we know those long run prices are going to be, well, if prices are too high and we know they're going to decrease, we know that we're going to experience deflation, we would also maybe cause this a deflationary gap, right? I'm going to use kind of those two terms interchangeably. Just two different ways of thinking about why that's like a recessionary or deflationary gap because GDP is too low and prices are going to be too artificially too high in the short run. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. Um, oh, I lost my pen cap, but that's neither here nor there. So, uh, in response to this, so that was a little bit of review, but in response to this, what's going to happen? Well, the current prices are too high. We know there's going to be deflation, right? So, kind of the opposite of before, excuse me, if we expect prices to be even lower in the future, right? What might we want to do is kind of increase our supply today, or we see this increase in short run aggregate supply. We would also see that expecting lower prices, we hire more workers today. There's an increase in real wages. So if employment goes up, the output levels we can get also increase at every single kind of current price level. So you can almost think about this as like our long run, short run aggregate supply curve. In response to this decrease in aggregate demand, we're going to see short run aggregate supply increase over time until we get to this long run equilibrium where everything is equal to each other. Okay. So these kind of shifts in aggregate demand will subsequently cause shifts in aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply until we get to that long run equilibrium. Okay. Let me see if I can get the colors to pop a little bit more here. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Okay. All right. Um, so the next thing we want to kind of work through. So we kind of looked at this example. What if, so we talked through, there I've got kind of a change in that short run aggregate supply into with a long run kind of outcome. What if instead um, we had long run aggregate supply increases, right? So what if we see an increase in pull? So I think I kind of went a little bit out of order. We looked at these last class, but let's say I have something that changes my long and short run aggregate supply, right? Well, if it shifts it enough, right, we actually could see that we know where things are going to get to in the long run, but they currently might not be at that level, right? So this graph, I kind of drew it a little bit extreme, but if this is our initial price, we know that actually the long run price, where long run aggregate supply hits aggregate demand, right, is going to be at a very low level. Almost here, it's almost to the point where prices are zero because I drew this very extreme. But in the short run, where does my aggregate demand hit my short run aggregate supply? It's at a point that's a little bit too high, right? So if my short run aggregate supply doesn't shift immediately as much as that long run aggregate supply curve does shift, I could end up with still a recessionary gap, right? In which case, what will be the response? Well, if expected prices are even lower, we would see an even further increase in aggregate supply until we get to that long run equilibrium. So I think here I'm going to draw out both of these. So I'm actually going to draw this one out just to kind of see and show you how you would do this. And then we'll instead look at what if there's an inflationary gap example. Okay. So where are we at in time too? I want to make sure. Okay. So let's say I start out with that first example. I think this will help. And then we'll kind of go in through a second one, right? So we've got price levels, we got aggregate demand. Let's see, we've got long run aggregate supply here. I've got short run aggregate supply initially starts here. Here's my initial price level. Here's my initial kind of GDP. If we have something that shifts long run aggregate supply, right? So here's my kind of new long run aggregate supply curve. But its impacts on the short run aggregate supply aren't immediate. Okay. So potentially I have something that looks like this, where yes, my short run aggregate supply, so maybe this was like an increase in overall productivity. And so maybe there was an immediate shift in the short run aggregate supply, but also factors of production we said can't update overnight. And so potentially that increase in the short run aggregate supply wasn't as large initially as that long run aggregate supply increase. And I'm sorry, these are not perfect. These should be parallel lines, but you know, I'm kind of drawing quickly here. So where should our long run equilibrium be? Right? Well, we know the long run equilibrium will be where the new long run aggregate supply hits our aggregate demand. So prices in the long run should be here, and GDP in the long run should be out here. However, in the short run, where does our aggregate demand hit our short run aggregate supply? Well, here, after that change, here's the short run aggregate, or kind of the, sorry, short run GDP. Here's our short run price. So what do we have? We've got current prices are greater than where we know prices are going to be in the future. Or we expect lower prices, or we expect deflation. So we've got this deflationary gap. Another way of thinking about this, our current short run GDP is less than what we know the long run real GDP is going to be. So if output is too low, economic conditions must not be good. We've got a recessionary gap, right? So this is kind of our recessionary gap. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So the next thing we'll kind of talk through, sorry, go through one more step and then we'll switch gears. So if this is the case, if we kind of expect prices to be lower in the future, how do we end up getting to this kind of long run equilibrium? Well, companies, will adjust, right, to the fact that prices they know are going to be lower in the future. So they're going to increase, right? If prices are low in the future, we want to kind of supply more today until we kind of see this short run aggregate supply increase even more. Sorry, I think I was writing quickly. This should be a 2. And then this shifts over time. So we can think about short run aggregate supply 3, or eventually our short run aggregate supply shifts enough until we get to that long run equilibrium point. Okay. So the response to this deflationary recessionary gap is the same that we talked about when we had aggregate demand shifts. Okay. So the next thing we'll kind of talk through is what if we had the reverse? So what if we don't have a um, decrease, or what if we don't have an increase in long run aggregate supply, but what if we have a decrease? Okay. Actually, I could even do, yeah, we'll do the decrease. I think that'll be more helpful to do that first. And if we have time, we'll kind of do another example of an inflationary gap. And if we don't have time, we'll kind of hold off and do that tomorrow. So let's say I've got real GDP, got prices, I've got my aggregate demand curve, I've got this long run aggregate supply curve. Initially, we'll start out in equilibrium. So here's my short run aggregate supply. Here's my initial price, my initial GDP. Okay. Let's instead assume that I've got kind of a, let's say, labor supply. And this is once again in the problems. I'm not just always going to tell you long run aggregate supply decreases or increases. I'll give you a change, and then you should know based off of what we talked about in Module 5, which of these curves is going to shift. So labor supply was one of those factors of pull. If labor supply goes down, we're going to see kind of a decrease in our long run aggregate supply. So this would be kind of our new long run aggregate supply. In which case, we know that the new long run GDP will eventually be at this point where long run aggregate supply hits aggregate demand. And eventually, our prices in the long run will rise this amount or rise to this level. However, if in the short run, that short run aggregate supply curve doesn't shift as much, or factors can't update automatically overnight, where could we end up with this short run equilibrium? Well, in the short run, right, aggregate demand will hit short run aggregate supply here. So this would be our level of GDP, or real GDP. I'm kind of shorthanding. And this would be our kind of short run price. So our price in the short run is too low, right? It's lower than long run prices. So what do we expect? We expect over time, those prices will increase to the long run level, or we could think about we have this inflationary gap. Another indicator of this inflationary gap is the fact that when we're looking at GDP in the short run, right, it's actually greater than my GDP in the long run, which tells me that like time economic conditions are good, right? That I actually have current real output that is higher than what it will be in the long run. So if they kind of firms expect this inflation moving forward, they'll adjust accordingly, shifting short run aggregate supply kind of until we have, or we could think about this as like my long run aggregate supply curve, and we end up at this long run equilibrium. Okay. Any questions? So for the most part, directional changes. When it comes to this quiz, directional changes. Uh, I might add in some questions tomorrow that I wouldn't expect for the quiz that I might expect for the exam. And it's really going to be similar. It's just like if I told you it's mostly the numbers would be associated mostly with when we have simultaneous shifts. And essentially what they would be doing is telling you which of those shifts was larger, in which case you then know kind of what is going to happen to long run prices. But for the most part, directional changes. Yep, not numerical examples. So in the short run, we primarily want to think about kind of there is this cyclical nature to, so we can think about the cyclical nature of the economy as being primarily what is shifting the short run aggregate supply. Yes, I would to anchor your idea of this, think about it that way, right? Um, although technically it could be things. So yeah, the one I would focus on is what could increase or decrease this is primarily employment or unemployment. That's going to be um, perfectly correlated with increases or decreases in economic conditions. And so, yeah, if it's the most helpful, think about the cyclical nature of the economy, you know, recessions versus improving current economic conditions are going to then impact employment levels, kind of cyclical unemployment or cyclical employment, which would then kind of shift, pushing us towards that natural unemployment rate or the natural employment rate until we get to that long run equilibrium. Because one of the different definitions we had of the long run equilibrium is we're back or we are currently, we get to this natural level of unemployment, which does not include cyclical unemployment. Okay. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So at this point, let's kind of stop here. Let me see what else I want to do. So we've got some other examples. Um, I think I'll just work through more of them if we do have time today. But what I want to do first, and I'm going to come down here. I forgot to add this before today's class, so it's just floating around back in the background. We'll double check here that I've got the time limit on it set correctly, and we can kind of preview it together. Let me make sure so I don't have the time limit. So let's make sure that gets set, and then we'll jump into it here. So it should be under now kind of this module 6. So we'll jump into kind of work on this together. I've got to go to build and then preview, and we can kind of talk through both of these. Okay. So if we think about, and this will be a little bit of a step back from what we talked about today, a little bit more of yesterday, but we'll start to throw this in tomorrow when we look at different combinations of shifts. So let's say I've got worsening economic conditions abroad. What's going to happen? So hold on, conditions abroad will be created in response. Okay. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of what would it is, if economic conditions are worsening abroad, that's going to be something that causes a shift in our aggregate demand curve. And then in response to that, how will short run aggregate supply change? Okay. So this is related to what we talked about today. So let me get this here. So what are we looking at? Well, if economic conditions abroad worsen, right, then that means we have fewer trading partners, right? We're exporting less. Part of our aggregate demand was the exports that we had. That was part of our real GDP. So we've got this long run aggregate supply curve. We've got our short run aggregate supply curve and our initial kind of starting GDP, real GDP, and price level. If exports go down, that was one of the components of GDP. So we're going to see an aggregate demand decrease, right? So this aggregate demand decrease, right, is going to do what? Well, in the short run, right, it's going to push our new short run price and our new short run GDP to both be lower. Now, our eventual long run equilibrium will be where this new aggregate demand curve hits our long run aggregate supply. So in the long run, prices will be even lower than they are in the short run, but GDP will return to its old levels, right? There's none of the factors of production pull that have changed. And so in the long run, our real GDP returns to its old levels. So if we think here, how do we then get back to the long run? So if, first of all, I think the question was if they worsen, well, we have kind of long run GDP is greater than the current levels. So that means GDP is too low. We also expect prices to be lower in the future. So we have a recessionary or deflationary gap. Okay. In response to that, what's going to happen? Well, the short run aggregate supply curve must shift to the right or increase, right? Until we get to this point where our new short run aggregate supply hits long run aggregate supply, hits the new aggregate demand curve. Okay. So when we're kind of selecting the answers there, we know that we're going to have a deflationary or recessionary gap. And if we expect these lower prices in the future, right, they should be even lower. We should see that short run supply is actually going to shift to the right or increase. Okay. So that was the first question. Okay. So instead of kind of flipping back and forth here, the second question has this idea of what if we instead see labor supply decrease? So what type of gap is that going to cause, right? So if we have a labor supply of our economy decrease, in response to that, right, we expect prices to be higher. What's going to happen to our short run aggregate supply curve? So we'll work through an example where we have this long run aggregate supply change. So here I want, let's see, let me make sure I'm reading this correct. So we've got labor supply decrease. Yep, so that's what I wanted. So if we have this labor supply decrease, here's our kind of real GDP, right? And here's our overall price level. Here's our aggregate demand. Here was our long run aggregate supply initially. And we'll assume here was our starting short run aggregate supply. Here was our initial price. Here was our initial GDP. Okay. So if this is the setup and we then see labor supply decrease. So labor supply is one of these factors of pull, right? So if we see long run aggregate supply decrease, right? And here's an interesting example where we didn't quite talk about this. I actually drew one that was uh, similar to this, but probably a little more realistic. But let's just assume that that factor that impacts aggregate supply, let's say that that decrease in labor supply that companies can't adjust immediately. Now, what would probably make a little bit more sense here is if instead of a labor supply decrease, I said there was a decrease in the overall education level, in which case we know that that's one of the factors of pull. It would shift longer aggregate supply. Um, However, if companies can't adjust to that overnight, right, in their hiring decisions, potentially we could see no change in short run aggregate supply. So the way in which this question is written, I would have to give you that additional assumption, but sometimes in these daily quizzes to make sure people are either attending live or watching this, um, I, you know, might leave some pieces of information out. Okay. If anyone wants to check me right quick, because mine went away. How much time is left on the timer?
For me, I have 4 minutes and 30 seconds.
Okay, that should give us enough time here. I just want to make sure we had enough. So, what is that going to do? If we see no shift in short run aggregate supply, well, we know that in the long run, aggregate demand is going to hit aggregate supply here. So, we know that our GDP in the long run will be here. Our price level will be here. However, short run aggregate supply hasn't updated yet, so our short run prices actually haven't changed. They're completely, this would be an example where right now they're completely sticky. It's going to take more than a day for these companies, right, for the economy to adjust. So this is an extreme example where we end up with the current level of GDP is too high, prices are too low, so we expect prices to be higher in the future. We've got an inflationary gap. So once again, if I was giving this to you on a quiz or an exam, I would give you the additional assumption that this not only impacted long run aggregate supply, that short run aggregate supply isn't able to change in the short run. Now, over time, the fact that we know prices are going to be higher, how do we get to this long run equilibrium? Our short run aggregate supply curve is going to decrease, right? We expect lower prices in the future. That's not good. Or sorry, higher prices in the future. Um, the subsequent kind of impacts on that, we said were, lower levels of GDP, increase unemployment, meaning we can't, produce as much as before. So let me make sure. What do we have in the chat? So that second question, hold on. My Zoom is, oh, am I frozen? Hmm. Well, this is not good. Okay. Sorry. Can you guys still hear me? Someone to put something in the
Yes, we
chat.
can.
Okay, sorry, my computer went a little haywire there and I couldn't open anything up or click on anything for a second. So, um, that second question we kind of had, there's an inflationary gap, and in response to that, we'll see short and aggregate supply decrease. Okay. So if you weren't able to get that in within the time, since I just had that little hiccup, right after class, I'll go in. So anyone who submitted it live during class, I'll just kind of change it from being late, um, to accepting it on time. So you kind of have that inflationary gap, and we would see that short and aggregate supply would have to decrease in response to that. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So we have 10 minutes left. What do I want to do here? I think it's worthwhile to go through one more example here. So let's say, all right, there we go. So let's say instead we've got something that is going to shift long run aggregate supply. So let's say we do it this way, right? If I tell you that we know prices in the long run have increased, right? So if prices increase, right? And I tell you that this came from the fact that education levels increase and that at the same time we have, oh, what's a good one we haven't used today? So we've done interest rates, we've done, oh, let's say we expect future income to be higher. Okay. So if this is the case, and we know that the total effect is that long run prices are increasing. So what's going to have to be true? Which of these effects was actually larger, right? Now the answer could be it doesn't matter, but we don't know that until we actually kind of work through this example. So once again, what I would do is kind of draw these out separately. Okay. So the initial thing that I would draw out is here was our starting based off of our long run aggregate supply. Here was our price. Here was our GDP level. If we see, and I could have like my short run aggregate supply in here as well. If I see this increase in education, I know that's going to impact my short and kind of long run aggregate supply curves. Okay. So what impact is that going to have? Right? It's going to push my prices both in the short run and the long run down. It's going to push my GDP in both the short run and the long run to be higher. Right? So I know that this education increase caused my supply curves, my long run, short run aggregate supply curves to also increase. Remember, shifts to the right are increases. That ultimately pushed my long and short run prices down and my long and short run real GDP to be higher. Now, if at the same time I have an increase in expected future income, so we're going to draw that down here. So we got GDP, we got prices, we got our initial aggregate demand curve, we've got our initial kind of aggregate supply, we've got our short run aggregate supply, current price level, current level of GDP. Okay. When I have this increase in expected future income, we said if we think we're going to have higher income in the future, people start to act today as though they already have that income. So what's that going to do? All right. Well, the impact there that we're going to have, and let me actually, can I get this all over here? Yeah, so I want to do like a running kind of summary of this. So should, wanted to be a little bit more specific here. It's going to decrease both short run and long run prices, and it's going to increase both short run and long run GDP. Now, this aggregate demand increase, right, expecting higher future income increases consumption today, which increases my aggregate demand. What's that going to do? Well, that's going to push my prices up, right? But this is only prices in the short run. Okay. Now, what that also is going to do is increase my short run GDP as well. So this increase in aggregate demand, right, is going to cause my short run prices to go up, my short run GDP to also go up. Okay. So if I know that if I was thinking about, so I think I gave you prices in the long run, but let's also assume, just to kind of work this complete example, let's say prices in the short run, I told you were going up. So kind of the total effect in the short run is that prices go up. I then ask you which of these shifts must be larger. Well, they're pushing the short run price in opposite directions. So what must be true if the prices go up, that aggregate demand or the kind of change caused by higher future income must have been greater than that increase in education levels, right? That's the only way I could end up seeing short run prices go up. Any questions on that? And I also want to make this point. Does it matter if I'm talking about short or long run prices? Well, in the long run, what happens? Our short run aggregate supply responds to this, if GDP is too high, an inflationary gap until we get to that long run equilibrium where prices are now even higher than they were before, but GDP hasn't changed from this aggregate demand shift. So in the long run, what's happening here is my long run prices are going up, but what were the impacts on my long run GDP? Didn't change it at all. So once again, what's going to happen to GDP? Well, if these happen at the same time, I know GDP is going to go up. I don't know what's going to happen to prices. Once again, if we started out with the initial kind of setup, if I know long run prices have to be higher, then it's the same thing that we talked about in the short run. I know that it must be that my long run prices being caused by the aggregate demand shift were larger than the effect on my long run prices of that supply shift. So if I know the total effect, I can always determine which of those shifts must have been larger. Okay. And one of these, right, the change in aggregate supply potentially causes no inflationary or recessionary gap. If they happen at the same time in the short run, what must exist? Well, the changes in long run aggregate and short run aggregate supply, pushing that new equilibrium to this price level. Short and long run prices are the same. We have neither an inflation or recessionary gap. The aggregate demand shift, though, will cause in the short run GDP to be too high, in which case we would say we also see that the price is too low, or that we expect in the long run prices to go up. So we've got an inflationary gap here, even from these simultaneous changes. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay, so to kind of round out class today, um, we will pick up next class and I'll just work through some different combinations of simultaneous changes. We'll also think about what happens if we have changes to aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply simultaneously? So we looked a lot at long run shifts today. The cyclical nature of our economy, we said, can cause some shifts in short run aggregate supply. So we'll think about the simultaneous changes we could have there. It'll be very similar to what we talked about today, just slightly different, but we want to think about how these simultaneous changes, and if I gave you which one was larger, how that would impact whether there's an inflationary or recessionary gap. So we'll do that tomorrow, spend a decent amount of time on Module 6. I probably will start, I shouldn't say probably, we will start Module 7 tomorrow. However, I don't expect you to have that Module 7 reading done by tomorrow. I'll have it set so it must be due before we start class on Friday, which is the day that we will completely be working on Module 7. So you'll see that pop up on Canvas today, right? In fact, before we end class today, once again, my computer's having some issues. So if you go to the home page on Canvas, I think before we started class, I had it set so that it released. You can see module 7. You can see the top hat assignment. Um, and then I'll end up posting the materials for that as well. Okay. So I'm going to end the recording here. And then for those of you who are kind of here live, I'll leave it open in case you have any questions.